and democracy. There is no America. There is no democracy. We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business. And I have chosen you to preach this evangel.
For all my free market healthcare robbing, stock stealing, retirement fund fucking with niggas. Fuck you little credit card scamming, jewelry stealing, crack selling, liquor store robbing motherfuckers. Shout to the homies, Carnegie, OG, Willie Randolph Hearst, Baruch, Rockefeller, the real Rockefeller, my main bitch Leona, pour out a little Louis XIII, Scott Rothstein, Jack Abramoff, hold your head, my Rothschild niggas, let's get this money. I spend my day peppering America overseas, pension for the workers, nigga please, embezzlement, etiquette, private settlement, I'm better with Confederate rhetoric from my mansion in Connecticut, foreclose of it, close out the tenement, I twist words like a speech impediment, I hope you got good credit bitch, if not better get a new job with benefits, while I play golf with niggas to get cheddar with, new money buys brand new carrots, my old money bunch of great grandparents, you got grills in your mouth, I ain't mad at ya, I own every gold mine in South Africa, thanks baby, you made me $1 billion, plus I own a building, for each one of my children's children.
Hey everybody, this is Chris J here on Voice of Rebellion Radio. It is the 26th of June, 2016. That is, this is the fourth show of this month, and we're talking about the Western, well, I would say United States, NATO. We're going to mostly sum it up in the recent era imperialism in Africa, and talk about some of the some African heroes, some African menaces. When I talk, we're talking about menaces towards Africa, such as Cecil Rhodes, King Leopold, and a few others that have been left out of our textbooks suspiciously. Some of the most awful men in history, but since their victims were African, it seems like we have a little bit of different perspective on this. Also talk about some of the more heroic people and the actions that happened in Africa, and I'll go a little bit back to War One into the 1800s. So like the last 200 years mainly, and talk about the colonial powers as they tried to keep their grip on Africa, and as they were losing it, some of their more desperate measures that they went to, and more horrific measures that they went to, as they were losing power inside of Africa. And this included the mass murder of many of the citizens inside of Africa, mass murder of in different countries, and there was also the complete segregation, stripping away of their identity, as we've seen in some of the countries. Now, just to give an overview of Africa, is that this is the world's largest continent. It's kind of funny that even one simple fact that our perspective on the size of the continent is a little bit twisted, because the Mercator map that most of us look to when, this is what the map that's been taught to us since we were little, of what the size of the world's continents are. And you see Africa doesn't look to be that impressive, but it's kind of made smaller than what it actually is, because the Mercator map mostly favored wealthier countries, and it over-exaggerated the size of some of the wealthier countries, when in reality Africa absolutely dwarfs the size of Europe. On the Mercator map, it looks somewhat comparable. In reality, Europe is the size of the entire continent of Europe is about the size of the United States, and the United States fits in the upper left-hand quarter of Africa, and doesn't even take up, I don't think, the entire Sahara Desert. Africa, in reality, is a much larger continent than we are taught to believe, and it's very interesting that's a very simple fact we have a twisted notion on. Another twisted notion that we have is that before colonialism of the European powers, that Africa was an uncivilized hunter-gatherer society, which that was rather not true, that they had actually very civilized countries, and they even had kingdoms and empires that were at one time rivaled the European powers, or were even more powerful. Definitely rivaled with the European powers. And if you go back into the distant past, we had Mali, which is now the same Mali that exists today in Northwest Africa, but then it was a very prosperous empire. You had a few other empires that were in the during like the medieval times and before. It's kind of weird. In the medieval times, the African countries seemed to do very well, while Europe, they suffered with many things because of plague, terrible economic conditions, and extreme repression from the church and state that were one at that time. While in Africa, they seemed to do very well, mainly on the trade of gold and controlling the trade of gold inside their country, which now it's kind of interesting that Africa has been practically turned into a neo-colonial colonies because partially, or actually really ultimately the main reason is that they don't control their own currency. And then when one of these African countries splits away and doesn't want to be ran by some foreign country's currency, then you see them start to go to very hard measures against one of these African countries, which doesn't seem to happen too much. And that's how foreign powers are able to control their resources, control all their operations when it comes to diamonds, oil, gold. This is a very natural resource-rich continent with just a plethora of natural resources. Every single country seems to have something, whether food-related at the very minimum, where it's a major exporter, at least at the very minimum, of fish. And that's your poor, your least rich African country. So really, ultimately, when you look at it, the question should be, well, is Africa poor, or are they being exploited and robbed? And it's really the latter, because if they were using their in each country had a nationalized natural resource reserve, like what they were doing in Libya, they'd be a very prosperous and rich country, like Libya was under Gaddafi. And now that Libya is no longer under Gaddafi's control, it's completely fallen apart. Because Gaddafi actually valued his citizens, actually valued his people, and strived to make his country better. And one of the things he did was nationalize their natural resources in his country. And now I nationalized a lot of services throughout his country. And because of that, Libya did very well for a few decades especially before the 86 bombing. Then it kind of went downhill. But then they did still pretty well in the 90s and 2000s. Also, tourism is a factor. But Gaddafi, similar to Mugabe, or similar to Lumumba in the past, or Sankara, were leaders that truly believed that the African country should be sovereign and not under control of one of the different blocks or foreign powers from outside of Africa. And right now, Mugabe is really, when you look at it, is the only leader that truly believes that today, because Mugabe is the only one that still that really values the African people inside of Zimbabwe rather than foreigners having their land. South Africa, when you look at it, is ultimately somewhat sold out a little bit with the current president Jacob Zuma to United States influence to an extent, but I think that they ultimately are fighting, and it's an infight between the American influence and the Russian influence, and possibly them joining BRICS, which would be a very good move for South Africa's future. But I ultimately think that Mandela didn't go as far as Mugabe did, and Mandela ultimately, in a way, set the path for imperialists to make a neo-colonial state rather than a more primitive towards full colonialism like it was under apartheid South Africa, where British, Dutch interests controlled the country, and a few British and Dutch officials with their population that amounted of 10 to 15% of the people controlled the country, while 85% of the people suffered under and were treated as lower class citizens during the apartheid that lasted for 46 years before it ended in 1994. And the apartheid was it's a more one of the more visible symptoms of what had been done to Africa for a long time and is still being done to Africa to this day. And it's just a little bit more hidden, and it's a little bit more it's a little bit more implicit how these consequences are being put upon against the African people, because you look at the countries, yeah, they're all independent. There is no more really white minority rules happening anymore, where a country has 2% of the population is white, but yet its president and its government completely are white. That doesn't happen really in today's Africa. But what does happen is African countries being ran by people that take orders from France or Britain or the United States 100% and act to be independent sovereign leaders, but ultimately just puppets from abroad, or being literally given orders by AFRICOM, which is the United States African Operations Center that they have there. I think it's over in Djibouti. And that, since it's done that way, people are a little bit less keen to seeing the colonialism that exists today in the continent of Africa, which is still very it's still very visible to I think people that have that keep up with who truly owns what, what's the relations with these countries, with other countries, the foreign relations with many of these countries inside of Africa. And you look nowadays, we even have in Egypt, it seems that Sisi's became quite a disappointment, where it seems like Sisi, while he kind of promised that he was going to be different than Morsi, who became an American puppet, or was always an American puppet, just like his predecessor Mubarak, who he promised change from Morsi, and ultimately just became a Turkish-American puppet. In the end, when he fell out of power, a lot of the world rallied around Sisi to finally give Egypt what they deserved, a sovereign leader, a strong leader, to finally end this period of imperialism inside of Africa that they suffered ever really since Nasser left, that they pretty much just seemed to have fallen right back into Western influence after they had worked so hard against it and made society against the Western influence that existed before. And now Sisi becomes president, and then his first year or so, he seems to he's the de facto president of Egypt until he actually gets officially elected. Then then he starts to be a little bit shaky when it comes to the Israel-Palestinian situation, and he seems to start leaning towards Israel. And now this is what happens. It seems like every time that he's going to break away, or seems to be turning the corner and actually going to be pro-Palestinian and help out the Palestinian people, he signs another agreement with Israel. So Sisi, despite and here's the thing, is that as a story that was made for the Egyptian people and the Egyptian revolution that happened in 2013, we want a lot of the world wants to rally around Sisi, wants to believe that he's different, wants to believe this is the guy this is bringing back the era of Nasser. It even sort of seems, a little bit like Nasser, a former military man that served under a previous weak/corrupt regime, and eventually became the president. I would say is not even comparable. The level of bad that was Mohammed Naguib and Mubarak, which talk about Nasser served under Naguib and Sisi served under Mubarak. But it seemed like it was a similar situation, but in the end, it looks like it's not really a similar situation. Now it's almost been 3 years since the second Egyptian revolution, which actually the anniversary comes up next Sunday, when my show is happening, which was July 3rd, 2013. They overthrew Morsi from power, and right around now there was huge protests. It was I remember it happening very clearly, and I remember the day I was watching RT, the developments that said Morsi could be overthrown, or was being overthrown, and I couldn't believe it, and I was very happy to see it, because Morsi to me was just an telltale, utter disappointment of the infiltration of the revolution against Mubarak, that Morsi was put in power. and then to see Morsi negotiating pretty much right into Israel's hand when he was negotiating the Israel-Palestinian end of their little conflict they had in November 2012. And to see Morsi pretty much just taking the United States side in the situation and just doing it so the United States wouldn't have to. They realized that was exactly what Morsi was, and he was ultimately just like, the Turkish president or the Qatari monarchy, which these are regimes that claim to be pro-Palestinian on the surface, and they say these symbolic things every now and then, but ultimately trade with Israel and do jobs for Israel, like what Turkey is doing. Turkey's one of the top 10 traders with Israel, but they claim to be anti-Israel. Qatar funds all of Israel's allies inside of Syria and is against Israel's major foe in the Middle East, which is Iran, and their second biggest foe, Syria. And Qatar funds all of Israel's proxy, it seems like, in the Middle East. So it seems like that's what Morsi was, is that he was just symbolic, a symbolic, or what what you just call it. It's a Palestinian. They're pro-Palestinian only when they say that just to help their political causes, but ultimately they don't really believe it because they ultimately do the opposite. And Sisi was expected to be against Israel and be pro-Palestinian, but ultimately it seems like he's failing us, isn't he? And hopefully, I think the only thing we can hope at this point is that, maybe it's time for this third Egyptian revolution, and time to bring in somebody different to him. Sisi ran against a true Nasserist and pro-Palestinian, and he absolutely got crushed. But it seemed like that Sisi didn't matter because Sisi was also had these tendencies and would at least he was a known name, he was a strong leader that could bring Egypt back to order, and at the same time establish somewhat what they had back during Nasser and their anti-Zionist stance and pro-Palestinian stance that they had before. But as I said, it's not how it always appears on the surface. When you look at Africa, part of the reason, and again, it seems like I always come back to it, but there always seem to be the footprints of a lot of the things that a lot of these bad things that are happening around the world, and a lot of these wars and a lot of these dictatorships. Well, there's always seems to be Zionist footprints on it, and Israel is known to be helping. For example, in South Africa, they were helping inflict the misery onto the black South African population, because guess who in the end was their only open ally? They still had more secretive allies. There was only a few open allies that South Africa had at the end, and one of them was Israel. And who helped South Africa develop nuclear weapons? Remember, South Africa was nuclearly armed and looked like they were ready to go to nuclear war towards the end of the 70s into the early 80s, when the world was starting to turn against South Africa. The South African government and the apartheid, and it became more open, and there was a huge boycott in 1976. It's kind of like the untold boycott of the Olympics. There was 3 straight boycotted Olympics where a lot of countries didn't participate. 1976, they boycotted because of South Africa's participation in the event. 1980, there was of course the American boycott against the Soviet Olympics. In 84, there was the Soviet boycott against the American Olympics. So if they didn't have a full Olympics from all the countries participating from 1972 was the last one until 1988. And that's South Africa at that time, because they were becoming a pariah of the world, went to a very desperate measure and built nuclear weapons. They became one of the few nuclear weapon states on the planet. And just like Israel, they built theirs illegally with no approval of anybody, and highly and did a highly secret, did a very highly secretive building of their nuclear weapons. People talk about Iran and the potential that they're building nuclear weapons, but I think they've kept everything very public about any developments of the nuclear program. The truth is there is none that involves weapons. And in my opinion, I think it's also a lot of people that know the truth about the Middle East. When it's just I am straying over the Middle East, but I'm supposed to be talking about Africa. But when it comes to Iran, I think that a lot of knowing the kind of forces that are at play against Iran, I don't think anybody would that really knows the situation would really disapprove of Iran building nuclear weapons, because it just would be purely out of defense, and it might be the deterrent that keeps an invasion from happening in their country. But I think because they don't have that deterrent, they are going to get invaded. Because you see the countries that they don't want to touch. North Korea, they've never really started anything since the nuclear weapons have been developed. In North Korea, they're not willing to do any kind of, shoot a couple of their soldiers or anything like that. No, they've been very cautious with them. Iran, they pick off their nuclear scientists. In reality, they've been a little bit too weak when it comes to the Israelis and what they've done to their scientists, what they've assassinations, sponsoring terrorists, including the MEK terrorist group inside of Iran. All this stuff, I think, is a sign of weakness on their part. They should be a little bit more willing to stand their ground on when it comes to very blatant violations of their sovereignty by foreign countries of any kind. And it seems like it's a little bit different with Syria. They've had all these blatant violations of a sovereignty against them, but they're in the middle of a civil war. In Africa, blatant actions against their sovereignty happen all the time. And you have the complete destruction of their land against their culture in many of these places, being done purely for whatever natural resource they can scrap out of the continent. And we have a continent that is very poor in some places, and the people are very poor. People are starving in some of the most poorest countries on the planet, right there, especially on the West African coast. Yet they have some of the most oil on the planet. For example, Senegal is a very poor country, but is absolutely oil rich. And if you have a few oligarchs inside the country that are making a ton of money off of foreign importers buying their exports of their oil. And the same thing, I believe, in Sierra Leone. Like, Sierra Leone is like the fourth poorest country on the planet. And the average person, the average person's income in these countries are like hundreds of dollars, if that, per year. When you account for, how many U.S. dollars that'd be. These people get at the maximum. They're lucky to get $1,000 per year, and yet again, there's got tons of natural resources that are being looted out by Canadian, American. You have a British, French company. The French have also been a very big part in today of keeping a neo-colonialist threat against African countries, because they've gotten involved in some recent events in Mali, in their former territory there, in their former. They've also gotten involved in the Congo. They've gotten involved in a few other countries' affairs very recently. The French have had a history of being spites. They might be the friendlier face out of Britain and France over the years, but in Africa, it's ultimately the same. And France at one time had many colonies and had many colonies inside of Africa, including Algeria, which they didn't let go till 1960, something like that, until de Gaulle finally gave Algeria its independence that had been long awaited. But the French, the British, there was at one point there was just a mad race for all these countries to take all these colonies, that they potential colonies, the race for Africa. And you had Britain, France, Belgium, you had Italy, which had taken Libya, you had you even had Germany to a slight extent. And that's the funny thing about the whole thing, is that at the time of World War I, if we talk all the time about World War II and how Germany mistreated minorities, but you don't hear about in textbooks how in World War One how badly Africans were being treated by the Allied powers, and what was being done was the same genocides at worse levels than was being done during the Holocaust. I mean, for example, or was done shortly before World War One. I mean, just a few years before that, King Leopold was in power, and he is known to have killed 10 million Africans. The Belgium king who controlled the Congo, and Congo was controlled, I think, all the way up till 1960 or something like that, but controlled by Belgium. He had Cecil Rhodes from Britain, not long before that, in Zimbabwe, had killed 10 million Africans, and they had renamed it after himself, Rhodesia. The Rothschilds were also a big part, I believe, of they were a big part of creating Rhodesia, and Rhodesia was the bastardization of Zimbabwe and taking away their culture, their identity, their heritage by renaming it after the colonialist, the conqueror of Zimbabwe, and ultimately Zimbabwe became a colony of Britain for many years, all the way up to 1980. And during that time, there was apartheid, similar, where 1% of the people were white, yet they completely controlled the politics and the rule of Zimbabwe. It's kind of funny how, when you look into we look into our textbooks, and there's no mentions of these events. There's only mentions about what happened during there's mentions of what happened in the Holocaust. There's some mentions of what Stalin did to the Russians, but there's not too many mentions about what happened to the African people under these colonialist leaders over many years. And there was hundreds of years of misery sometimes put on these African countries. And people sometimes say, why weren't their leaders didn't stand up to, for example, when the slave trade was happening? Sometimes people blame the leaders of these African countries at that time. They're saying that they didn't have to allow it in their country. But when you look at what happened to, for example, one queen that rejected slavery in her country, of the slave trade that was going on from Europe to the New World, South and North America, and with African slaves, she ultimately got beheaded for it. So it wasn't no really voluntary interaction with the African leaders. They were pretty much forced into by the European leaders. And Africa was forced to partake in this all the way up into the 1800s. And what's left out sometimes is that these men that were involved in the slave trade it wasn't like, I think people almost think that these people were separate from the states, the monarchies of Europe at that time, the British monarchy, the Belgian monarchy. These people were right with them. And you had people over the years, the many different monarchs that were involved in this. People, we idolize in America, it seems like, these British monarchies, the British monarchy, and the stories of the different British monarchs over the years, and the different queens, the current queen, and the royal family just over the years seems to be idolized. However, you look at it, and there's no reason for them to be idolized. These people are responsible for millions of people dead during the time the British control of most of Africa, or not most of Africa, but 30% of Africa was under British territory. So we talk about these different monarchs over the years, and the different stories of what they did and their family, and this one did this and this one did that, but ultimately they were all involved with that. They were involved with the colonization over here. These were terrible men, and these were tyrants. And they didn't treat their own people that good. If they decided to rebel, they'd be hung. There was the debtors' prisons where if you couldn't afford to pay for in the prisons of Britain for water and food, well, you had to lick the water off the walls. These conditions were absolutely horrid, and these were all put on by the British monarchy. And these also were people that were in league with the Nazis, and to this day, the British monarchy continue to do very shady activities. And Queen Elizabeth, she controls 6 million acres of land. She still has a lot of power, and it's not all ceremonial and silly. No, she actually has the power to suspend Parliament or suspend the House over there in Britain. And that's definitely not ceremonial. That is, she still has the power to shut down their version of our Congress. So I think people think it's all silly at this point, that they don't have any real power, and there's no reason to hate on them. And they also are parasites that live off of the British taxpayers. That should be the next referendum that they have after Brexit. There shouldn't even be a referendum. There shouldn't even be a question. They should be gone. Should be in prison. The British monarchy, and it should cease to exist. There's no reason for it in modern day, and there's really no reason for it then. The British monarchy should be all in jail for many various different crimes, including killing one of their own, it appears. And just it's odd that a country that fought so hard back in 1776, and we value our American independence in the Revolutionary War, but it's because we broke away from those fucking guys, from the British monarchy and their taxes. We went to war over 3% taxes back then, but yet we seem to have completely lost a lot of our sense of the creation of this country. When you have people, every time that one of these Satan spawn that we call a British royal family is born, we, as the American people, it seems like that's all we see on the news. They'll play that for an entire day, solidly. When the British monarchy, when they have a kid, one of them has a kid, and then they do the whole ceremony and all that. And it's absolutely ridiculous and all flashy and all that. And to talk about that is that every time they have a kid, it's probably from they probably were cousins that mated, because they barely can. They definitely can. The reason why they got one of theirs killed was partially because not only did she not date within the royal circle, she was now trying to marry somebody that wasn't even from the same race, which they definitely do keep that in account, the British royal family. And she tried to date a very powerful Egyptian man. When you look at it, they a lot of times married their own cousins and stuff like that, because they tried not to marry outside their families too much. And there's a lot of intermarriage, and it leads to a lot of inbreeding, and that's why you have these disgusting characters. Like you have Prince Charles and was Prince Harry or whatever. These absolutely horrid figures, and you can definitely see the inbreeding in them. They all look a little bit odd, and they all look, these people are ghostly pale, of course, because they're never in the sun. They're inside their a palace that's paid for by the British taxpayers, which I think more and more are upset about that. But they're going to be distracted by this really, ultimately meaningless victory when it comes to this referendum to happen. It's a step, but it's almost purely symbolic, because when you think about what has actually changed after the referendum, it is not really much to celebrate about. When it comes to the referendum, like I said, the next referendum needs to be, if there even is a referendum for it, needs to be about the British monarchy and their future in Britain. Anyways, if anybody wants to leave some comments, I'll be checking the chat room later. But the problem is when I go to the chat room, it seems to kick me off of Skype. So I guess I'll just try to go over there, and I can just rejoin the call real quick, because what's the worst that happens? Drop off for a minute or two. Kind of sucks not having callers on the show, and we'll try to be making a change to May next week. We might have a way where I can bring callers on. So just to make clear, the phone lines are not open this week. I'm just going to be purely running this week's show. Hopefully, we actually make it through the full show without a hitch. We had some problems, as you know, the last show. We ran into some technical difficulties about 50 minutes in, but so far it's been so far so good on this show. Talk about Africa and imperialism against Africa and the plots against Africa over the years. You know, there's been quite a few plots against Africa over the years, but none more. There hasn't been too many more nefarious than I think trying to depose Muammar Gaddafi after what he did for his people, and that they reversed all of it. The elite bastards that killed Muammar Gaddafi in the end, and they tried to do it in '86, and they tried to depose him then, and they came back with the NATO bombing in 2011. And Muammar Gaddafi was trying to not just unite Libya and had united Libya under a currency that was not controlled by the Rothschilds. He wanted to unite all of Africa under the gold dinar, and it would be a gold-backed currency not controlled by the Rothschilds, meaning that at that point there would be no more foreign influence on Africa, and colonialism would finally come to an end. Something that hadn't happened in over 1,000 years plus. Since no foreign powers had any influence on Africa, well, you'd have to go probably back to the medieval times, like I said, when at that time they had the large empires, and you had the Kingdom of Mali at that time. You had a very powerful Mansa Musa, and a few other leaders I could think of that. A few other there was a few other statements of the much more civilized and independent Africa existed well in the past, but of course there was some problems back then too. But in comparison to what Europe was at that time, and the whole world seemed to be in a bad place at that time during medieval times, the Dark Ages, where we had the entire world suffering with disease, famine, war, worse than it is now. And some people speculate that what is happening now is almost similar to like the fall of the Roman Empire, and then afterwards, let's hope not, that leads to 1,000 years of medieval type rule over our planet. I think that's what some people speculate the New World Order will be somewhat like, is what happened during the medieval times. But I think during the medieval times, that was the start really for the Rothschilds and their plan towards the New World Order. When the Rothschilds came to prominence at the end of the medieval times in the 1500s, and they've changed their name most likely existed before that, because the Rothschilds, that's a made up name anyways. It just means Red Shield, because they're the Red Shield bankers. But the ultimate thing about ultimate thing when it comes to Africa just goes back to the same thing that we always talk about when we talk about the root of these problems, and it comes back down to banking and the currency. And the currency right now, as it is, Africa is controlled by pretty much the entire continent is controlled by the dollar or the euro. It's all pretty much foreign currency controls all of Africa, and they don't have their own sovereign currencies, and it's ultimately just two currencies that are owned by the Rothschilds. And we have all these foreign interests that are involved inside of Africa. So no really African country actually rules itself. And they're just ultimately just neo-colonial states for these European powers, or the United States, or Canada, which has lesser influence compared to Europe, or, when I talk about Europe, it's really Britain, France, Belgium, because they control the European Union. And so just like the old days, Belgium does have quite a bit of influence. And a few other countries. Italy has a lot of influence on Africa today. These just a few countries. So it's not really, when I talk about Europe, Russia actually seems to be wanting to try to make alliances with a few of these countries, such as South Africa, via BRICS, and Eastern Europe. They're not really a part of what removal Gaddafi and these other horrible things have been done in the recent years. There's as well, like I said, is our natural resources. None of it goes to their own people. They don't nationalize it. Very few countries have nationalized over the years, including the only one that has gotten nationalized I could think of is Libya, to the extent that they did, and people were able to live a very high standard of life that they experienced over the years of Gaddafi. While right now, ultimately what happens, a lot of these African countries, is that they let foreign interests come in, the foreign company come in, take whatever resource and sell it back to them, when ultimately what just happened is that it's been stolen and sold back to them for double the price it should be sold back to them, or what it's actually worth. So they're a country that is being exploited and being robbed 100%. And this is a high level of thievery that just happened that might be unprecedented, because this continent is so natural resource rich. They always have grabbed the interest of people, onlookers, looking to be opportunistic of the African resources. And with all that, is it really different from what, South America, all throughout the world? Ultimately, Africa is just one more victim of the New World Order and the Rothschilds and the top elite at play. And with all that aside, I'd rather, I would like to talk about a little bit about some of the heroes, at least some of the people that try to change it. And, for example, like Thomas Sankara or Gaddafi or Nasser, which Nasser, that's the one that comes to mind when it comes to a leader that really truly brought his country, at the state it was after it was a British protectorate, all the way up to until 1952. And the Guib took power, and the Guib was just kind of weak and wasn't really, he just kind of fell into power, but they need a stronger leader than that. And Nasser also, when he was in power, did something very good for the country, and they made alliances, Tito and a few other leaders in the non-aligned movement, which gave Egypt a few trading partners, but at the same time, it was an alliance that didn't require them to fall into the strong influence of either the Soviet Union or the United States, Britain, France. And it was a very smart move on their part when they did that. And within the 14 years of Nasser, I think it was 14 years. Well, actually, it was a little bit more. I think it was 16 years Nasser was in power. He built a very prosperous middle class during that time, and also freed Egypt of any possible or staved away any possible influence coming from Israel, and made a very strong stance against Israel, because Israel tried to bomb and tried pretty much to conquer Egypt during the 67 war, and Israel to this day will claim that Egypt were responsible for the 67 war, But ultimately, they're the ones that did invade, and even though there was some posturing before, which Egypt was involved in, ultimately Israel was the one that crossed the line and invaded. And when they did cross the line and invaded, they did stuff that was absolutely unforgivable, including the bombing of their hospitals inside of Egypt and schools, and I'm pretty sure they have schools and all these other grocery stores. Pretty much everything they do to the Palestinians all the time nowadays, they pretty much did to Egypt in 1967, just within a few days, and they killed a ton of their citizens, and it only lasted 6 days before they ultimately signed some kind of agreement, and both sides kind of like claimed victory, but ultimately probably Israel did get what they wanted, and they imposed their will on the African country of Egypt, and showed to Africa and the Middle East that Israel had no limits of what they'll do in warfare, and that they'll commit many war crimes, and that nobody will do anything about it. And that's what happened, because that was the first time really since 1948 that Israel was involved in a large war, and Egypt was the victim at that time. And then Nasser kind of lost some popularity afterwards, because the Egyptian people saw that he got them involved with that what they saw was there was not much benefits to get out of being involved in that war, but it was imposed on them. They had no choice. They just fought back against the invading Israeli forces. Invading Israeli force. And Egypt, though, if you look aside all that, that's the major criticism towards Nasser, is that he was involved in that. But there's all kinds of positives, including the middle class getting much bigger under Nasser. There's the positives that he provided his country with a lot of better services than there were existed before, and that he with these alliance that he was a founding member of the non-aligned movement before it became a much different organization that it is now. Where back then it was purely a alternative for third world countries against the Soviet and the United States blocs, and for their own sovereignty. It wasn't really truly against, it's just that they didn't want to be a part of it. And it was kind of against. They didn't really particularly like how either country was ran, the Soviet Union nor the United States, which the problem with those countries at that time was that, well, the United States is self-explanatory, talking about the CIA and what they were involved with, and it's that the United States has fallen to fascism a long time ago, and the Soviet Union wasn't respecting the sovereignty too much of the third world, and ultimately there's a lot of suspicion about that ultimately the same ruling class that controls the United States, well, you have them controlling over there in the Soviet Union. So Tito just decided to stay to himself and make a nationalistic state where their own people respect the country that they live in, and try to work together also with their few allies in order to provide a good alternative to the Eastern Bloc and the United States/NATO bloc, which, how I see it, I would say it was kind of again another thing that you don't see in their textbooks is the story of Tito, because they try to put it black and white that socialism failed, that the United States was the ultimate winner of the Cold War, and that the only countries that were under the United States bloc had it any bit decent during the Cold War. But ultimately, I would say that the people that really went down in the 60s, at least, was Yugoslavia. And all the way up to the point until when Yugoslavia was forcibly broken apart by war that was sparked from outside interest. And they sparked the nationalism inside their country after Tito died and instigated the fire. And that was the nationalist inferno that followed into the 90s, where you had these very strong feelings of nationalism that wasn't existent for many decades, all of a sudden come out and was fueled by foreign agitators, who later, in the end, even after the country hadn't formally dissolved yet, in 99, they finished the job. NATO bombed Yugoslavia, and that was it. After just a few years after that, in 2003, Yugoslavia officially fell apart, and now it's 6 different countries. There's Serbia, Kosovo, there's Macedonia, there's Croatia, Bosnia. All used to be one country, Yugoslavia. Many different people and a few different cultures and a few different languages all used to be one country united. But Yugoslavia means South Slav land in, I believe, it's in Serbian. That's what it translates to. And that project all came to an end within just a few years after the few wars, and these are some pretty ugly wars. And what NATO did, people like to say sometimes that Bill Clinton didn't get involved in any wars. Well, under the Clinton administration, that happened, and the United States bombing with NATO Yugoslavia. And it's like it would be like, if you don't call that a war, then it's like calling the operation against Libya not a war, which it's definitely a war, and the United States was involved with it via NATO, which the United States ultimately pretty much dominates the policy of NATO. So it's a farce to say that was not a war. Well, anyways, we got about an hour, 10 minutes left, and I gotta say, I know if I seem a little bit low energy, it's because of kind of sucks not having a co-host on here, and hopefully we'll be fixing that soon, and because just to know that there's somebody to go to every now and then, rather than just my thoughts for 2 hours. And talking, saying a lot of things that I've said many times, and I think just doesn't register with people, or maybe they don't care, or I hope it's not. It's purely actually, that's probably a little bit better than it not registering, because I think after saying it 17 times, you would hope that it would register with them. But hopefully next week I'm probably going to do something maybe related to July 4th. I've done, actually, I think last year I did some kind of July 4th show. I'm not sure. Maybe I didn't do a July 4th show. I know I did a July 4th show the year before that. I remember doing that special on the actual day of July 4th. Maybe I'll do something July 4th related on the Sunday show that's going to be the day before officially. But hopefully that'll be a good show, and I think the show will. I'm starting to get into my flow somewhat after 50 minutes. It just seemed like going by a little slow earlier on the show, but I wanted to conserve what I was talking about so I don't use up all my good points until later on in the show, which now I think I can go into some of the stuff. I was talking a little bit earlier about the something interesting I saw is that during World War I, you had Britain and France still controlled. Most of Africa was still controlled by the Allied powers, but Germany was the only one that was. Germany actually sponsored a rebellion against the British and Italian occupiers inside of Somalia, and there was this rebel faction inside Somalia called the Dervish State, and Germany actually sponsored them. One of the people actually fighting for independence, and as well, there was a few other aspiring countries and such, but you could say Germany did purely for strategic purposes, but Germany was actually sponsoring the independence movements inside of some of the independence movements inside of Africa at that time, while the Allied powers inside during World War I were going to absolutely brutal tactics to keep their. This is during the time of Cecil Rhodes, or right after the time of Cecil Rhodes. Actually, it was right after the time of Cecil Rhodes. This is right after the time of King Leopold. This is right after the time, or during the time of some of those brutal, vicious monarchs that were ever in charge of the continent. To where now these same countries were now fighting in the World War, and they tried to paint out Germany like it was the same all the way from the start, from World War I to World War II. That it was the same country that was strongly against minorities of any kind and strongly against any people that weren't their own. But during World War I, Germany helped countries from the Ottoman Empire, a Middle Eastern country, to a few aspiring African independence movements, to as well that I think they also had some allies over here, possibly in the Americas. Let me look up real quick. I could think of there's a few other smaller, like they were co-belligerents officially. These smaller countries that were involved in World War I on the German side. I just find it kind of interesting because to me, that it seems to be the forgotten war, not talked about in the textbooks, and I think there's a few reasons for that. And they spin the story as saying that Germany started the war and such, which I think it's a complete lie, because when you look at it, they had ammunitions, they had on the Lusitania. They even had bombs on. That's why the thing sunk so quickly. The reason why that they talk about the war starting or the United States get involved is the sinking Lusitania mainly. Is one of the things they always go back to, and ultimately it was a ship loaded with arms that they were trying to prevent from getting to Britain, which would later be used in the war effort. But they say that they killed purely out of cold blood. Whatever the 1,200 civilians that were on board, rather than say that that they just had to do this, because if you keep doing that, then they just do the hostage tactic all the time, where they just keep these people on the ships just so they won't blow up, and they just put bombs on all these passenger ships, like they were doing on the Lusitania. And anyways, like the United States. The United States knew, because the British Navy had already cracked the German Enigma. They knew where these ships were, all in the Atlantic, and they could have put it away out of the path of the German submarine. They knew where the submarines were, but they put it right in the path of the German submarines because they wanted the Germans to fire on it, so they would have an excuse to get into the war. So the Lusitania was really the first false flag that the United States did. Also, there was the Maine that they're involved with, but the Maine didn't lead to the same consequences as World War I, where over 100,000 soldiers died. That was the first war that the United States participated in, that the United States lost more than 100,000 soldiers to a foreign enemy, because there was a civil war. It was 600,000 people or so died, but that was the Civil War. That was different than World War I, where also the United States got involved in a war that you looked at it and looked at the historical perspective. The United States had absolutely no point in being over there in Europe. They had never been involved in any kind of foreign war to that extent, where it's all the way over there on the other side of the Atlantic. But they were involved for some reason. Anyways, I found some of these countries. See, they had a few. They had a few allies. They had the Sultanate of Darfur, which was a monarchy. It wasn't exactly like an independence movement. What I'm just saying is that myth that the Germans didn't have friends from outside of Europe, and they only had Austria-Hungary as their only allies, what some people almost try to claim, or that's what people think, that is just Austria-Hungary and Germany. He was actually quite a few countries around the Central Powers, but it was not quite the jumping that they did. Was the many different European powers, France, Britain, the United States gets involved, the Russian Tsar, and there was somewhat of a betrayal that happened, because at the end, the Russian Tsar, many people will say that the British monarchy were the ones that brought about the Russian Tsar falling out of power. And we're nearing the 100th anniversary of the deposal of power of the Russian Tsar, which will be in February. And the Russian Tsar fell out of power in February 1917, and then the Bolshevik Revolution officially happened in October 1917, after years and years of it building up to that point. But some people say that the final push, or the actual 1917 spontaneous revolution, these people that all protest in the streets in the weeks before the forced abdication of the Tsar and the assassination of the royal family of Russia in 1918 was from the outside rather than spontaneous events happening from revolutionary activity inside the country. And during also the World War One, another myth I like to bust also is, I don't think I talked too much when I had out to my show about World War One, War Two, but it's the Turkish Dame, or was it, or the Young Turks, I think was the name of the group. This which is weirdly enough named after that one show, and he named it after that, I guess, the Young Turks, Senkungar, which I find to be a decisive, device. I find him to be very dividing individual inside the alternative media, who, this is pretty much it's pretty much the other side of the coin than Alex Jones, the false left-right paradigm that they're trying to push on truthers in the alternative media, with Alex Jones being the false right wing, and Senkungar being the false left wing. But the Young Turks were a group that was against the Ottoman Empire, but at the same time was against the Armenians living inside of inside the Ottoman Empire, and that they were the ones that actually did the Armenian genocide rather than the Ottoman Empire, which they fought both. They fought both the Armenians and the Ottoman Empire at the same time. And ultimately what they were, just agitators and colonial. They ultimately worked on behalf in World War I of the British intentions during the war, and which were a major part of the Middle Eastern theater, but mainly Britain and the United States. Not Britain and the United States. Britain and France were over on that part, while the United States jumped in. They were mostly inside, like Italy and stuff. Britain was actually way over there in the Middle East and North Africa. One thing that's forgotten about during World War I is that the theaters of war were much further reaching than told. I mean, there was battles even over in the Pacific and stuff during World War I. Yes, World War I, and there's stuff but it was generally kept to a minimum. There wasn't too much over there. There's some in the Middle East, and there was a lot in Africa, going even to deep Africa, into the Congo. There was battles, and of course there's what's mainly talked about, the European theaters and the trench warfare inside of France and neighboring countries as Germany headed towards Britain during World War I. What this all has to do with Africa is also, like I said, there were battles of World War I going into Africa, and I think that World War I was a turning point because the colonialism switched to more like a neo-colonialism, and it became less official. It became less officially colonialism, but just more secretive, and it became more hidden via neo-colonialism. And now people don't realize that these countries are still under control from Britain, France, and the United States, but they are, and it's done via the leaders take orders pretty much from outside forces rather than legislate on behalf of their own people. During World War I, also the Middle East. It was also a turning point for the Middle East, and ultimately was the World War I set the stage for the Balfour Declaration, and at the end of the World War I, Britain pretty much promised the Zionists that they would receive their illegal land of Israel in the end, and they would just pretty much give the Palestinians the land that they've had for hundreds of years they did the British Mandate, and then in the end it ended up in the Israeli hands. With the Britain supposedly putting up a little bit of a fight, is what they said, but in reality they just gave it to them. And in the end, after the King David Hotel bombing, the British were pretty much got the message that there was no option, and that even if they possibly had some kind of crazy turn of consciousness of the situation, that even if they wanted to, they could not give that land back to the Palestinians or keep it for themselves. They had to give it to the Zionists, or else they would have more Zionists dressed as Arabs blowing up their hotels. And going back to World War I, there was going back to World War I, here's what I talk about: is the Young Turks over there in the Middle East. They set the stage for the Ottoman Empire had to fall in order for the Israeli state to even have a chance of existing, because the Ottoman Empire controlled all the land practically around where they wanted to make the Greater Israel, or actually all the land where they wanted to make it Greater Israel. Remember that the Israeli project is not done. The Zionists want more land, and they eventually want to control everything from the Euphrates River to the Nile River. And right now they only control the small Israeli strip compared to what their greater plans are. You see what Thomas Herzl and some of these founding Zionists wanted. They wanted an empire built there that they controlled. And right now they're working, you see ISIS and the terrorists inside Syria and Iraq, and that's just going towards their greater plan of Greater Israel, which is much bigger than what they currently have of the current Israeli state. And the funny thing about the Zionists is that the original Zionists weren't even practicing Jews. They were atheist Jews. They were Jewish by blood, and they believed their blood to be superior than to the rest of the world. And doesn't that sound familiar? Is that they believed that by race that they deserved to have that land or deserved to have this, and that they should be treated differently. And so this is why people say Nazism and Zionism are so alike, because it is the same kind of race-driven ideology of we belong to this race and we have these genetics, so that means that we're superior to everyone else, which is absolutely absurd. But this is the case with what they believe, and they still. And they believe, you see their quotes by these top Zionist rabbis to this day, and they say stuff like that they're gods amongst men, and that they're divine, or that the rest of us are just animals. And you look again, like, well, this is where it's kind of funny. I got cut off by the technical problems right after I was talking about the Talmud last time on the show. But the Talmud, go research it if you haven't had the time to research it yet, about some of these excerpts and some of these things that were said inside the Talmud are some of the most despicable things to ever be put on paper. These are the words of these words are similar to what something you would expect to be inside of Nazi literature or something like that. And this is what the Zionists consider to be a holy book. These are not what all Jews consider to be a holy book. So, Jews that are against Zionism tend to more rely on the Torah for their religious advice rather than the Talmud, which this is what the Zionists follow, and this is what they believe to be not necessarily. This is kind of like how they guide their lifestyle by. And the Talmud says that says that the people that are non-Jewish blood or the people that are non-Jewish are animals. That these people that they're the goyim, or which is a derogatory word meaning cattle, when translated from Hebrew to English. The Goyim they're the third of them, and that they are the only ones. And it pretty much says takes the whole chosen people right to that next level, and pretty much says that they're the master race. And their characterization also of Christians and what it says about mocking the Christian religion, it was made as a reaction to the Christian religion. The Talmud would anger Christian Zionists to the point where they would immediately leave the Christian Zionist cult that has been built in recent years. It's terrible that people fall for their lies and still believe that anybody would fall for these Zionist lies, but that's what's happened. And via the church, that's been just one more vehicle of driving the propaganda home. When they say that, even when you have people like John Hagee that says that if you don't bow down to Israel, then you're going to go to hell. And that's what's happening, complete hijacking. And I can imagine is that they do the same things they do the same things in many different other, not just here. They've started to do in South America. They do it in mainly to Americans, because it seems that Americans via the tele-evangelist culture, where these certain preachers that they put and make famous, Americans are expert listen to them. They make them. They take their word as if it's coming from the Word of God themselves. It's taken from that comes from the Word of God Himself. I think that one of the things that we need to do, and even if you're not a Christian, you should see it, because when you think about it as this way, that there's still a community leader, the preacher, and their influence is very valuable. So we need to pass information out to the preachers around, and especially ones that are neutral or pro-Israel, and tell them what they do to Christians there. What these Zionist rabbis have said about Christians, the banning of holidays that Christians follow inside of Israel, including even Christmas. Which is not really a Christian holiday when you look at the history of it, but that's besides the point. Is that holidays that Christians like to follow are not really allowed inside of Israel, and the IDF and Israeli military have been known to interfere with it. So we should pass this information to them, and maybe we can start getting the truth about Israel put out that way, because they are very powerful, their word, because people highly respect these people more than maybe even their own family. I mean, you see sometimes the stereotypes. If you ever try to talk to your family about this, that when you start talking about these truthful topics, that your family thinks you're crazy. And I think many people here in the truth movement can relate to that alienated feeling that we've gotten. Speaking about stuff regarding the truth movement, talk about 9/11 truth, talk about the Zionists, talking about the New World Order, and and many other topics when we mention them. So I think that could be a very powerful project. And I know I'm not scared of the ramifications. I know what will say about us. They'll say we're passing out Islamist propaganda to Christian preachers, stuff like that, to make it really sound very harsh. The truth is just passing out the truth about Israel and the relationship with Christianity. And this is not talking about the Israeli people. We're talking about the Israeli government and the Israeli law system. And also you also go into the law system. And it's not, definitely the law system of Israel is not in favor of Christians, and definitely not even equal to Christians. It's 100% in favor of Israelis that are Jewish, 100%. It's a state that, anyways, they've even wanted to say, there's lawmakers inside of Israel that want to say that officially Israel is is a Jewish state, and remove any part of it being democratic, because they want to stop the illusion, because they know that they have no ground to stand on to call Israel any bit democratic. There is no part of it's democratic. It's only a select few get to be any part of the process of the Israeli politics and who controls Israel in reality. well, no one really has inside of Israel, besides a very few select people, have any say of what happens to that. Which we know that Israel is ultimately was a project that was created by the Rothschilds. You look at who created the Knesset; it was a Rothschild. You look what street the Knesset sits on; it's Rothschild's Boulevard. So when you have the Israeli Supreme Court, I mean, it's on Rothschild Boulevard. You have all these telltale fingertips or fingerprints of who could really control Israel, but people seem to ignore it because reality is inconvenient for them. Because people have been swept under these lies that they tell us that Israel is holy, or that it's the holy state, and anyone that must control Israel must be of the same way. But it's not that way. And every time I seem to go into some kind of rant about it, but it's because their propaganda is far-reaching, and you see that they spend an equal amount of time trying to discredit us. They spend a lot of money, and they pay people a lot of money to spread lies for them. And it's very telling that when you need a PR staff constantly lying for you, the PR staff that people are paid $2,000 and stuff like that. I think $2,000 a year, and you don't have to have like any kind of credentials or anything. You can just all of a sudden, call up one of their propaganda offices or whatever, and then you can make $2,000 for promoting / sponsoring Israel online, is what they would say. And they're not going to say spreading lies and propaganda for the Israeli government and whitewashing what they've done to the Palestinians over the years, and whitewashing what they've done to Middle Eastern leaders, African leaders, and really just their crimes against humanity over the years. But going back to it, I'm going to go back to talk about the interesting thing of the Young Turks, and this is what made the Ottoman Empire fall, which is a crucial step to the creation of the State of Israel. Because after the Ottoman Empire fell, the Balfour Declaration was wrote. During World War I, there was the Armenian genocide, and the killing of the Armenians. This majorly what discredits the Ottoman Empire when you talk about it in history, because they say the Ottoman Empire was responsible for the killing of the Armenians, but it was actually the Young Turks were heavily involved. And there was a mass ethnic wash that happened there in around 1915 through 1917, and the Young Turks tried to, or when we talk about the Young Turks, they say that they weren't the ones that are involved with it, but you look at it, that they used starvation, torture, and they marched them to death during their genocide against the Armenian people. They said that 1.2 million Armenians were forcibly deported from their home villages. As a result, about half of them died of exposure, hunger, disease, and were victims of banditry and forced labor. Which, as you see, is they did genocide in not necessarily the way of taking you to the gun line or taking you to the firing line and killing you. Via that, they just did it by ways of destroying your house and then forcing you to be exposed to the disease and the cold, or starving by taking away their food, like similar to what happened in the at Holodomor, or what in Ukraine during this, when Stalin did the forced starvation of those millions of people there. It was kind of a similar situation. It was a genocide via starvation, via food, via taking away their resources, rather than a genocide via direct killing of people, just simply taking them to the line and shooting them and burying them. No, it's done a little bit more, was done a little bit more with this what the Young Turks did, a little bit more discreet, and could be blamed on other stuff. Oh, there was a famine, there was a shortage, blah 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 blah. But in all reality, they were killed by them, and it's all documented. And the Armenians were Armenians did face this. What's funny is that when you look at the ADL, the American Defense League, which will sack you so bad if you're anybody of any kind of power and you even question anything about the Holocaust. But when you talk about the Armenian genocide, it's not even recognized. It's not even a thing that's they say, according to them, there was no documented genocide there, and I guess they're trying to say there's almost like rumors or something like that, rather than documented fact, when it was documented fact. But it's the same thing with what happened in Rhodesia, or what happened in South Africa, what happened in Rhodesia during or in the Congo was the genocides that happened by King Leopold and Cecil Rhodes. I don't think those are probably recognized there either, because when they it's these people killed more people, killed about the same amount of people that Hitler killed officially. That's the official numbers. Hitler killed 11 million people in the Holocaust, and King Leopold killed. These are low estimates. I think on King Leopold, 10 million, and Cecil Rhodes, 10 million. But I think King Leopold, some say it was upwards from somewhere between really like 15 and 30 million people he killed. It's like when talking about Africa, this is left out. The Belgian monarch that did this, the Cecil Rhodes, who once said that being English is like winning the lottery or being born English is like winning the lottery of life, which at the time was pretty true. The British were still very powerful, and being British had a lot of benefits to it, as English was a language that they forced a lot of their colonies to learn. That's why you see African countries with people that have fluent English skills or fluent one European country, a different European country, another's language skills, was because it was forced upon them by whoever. Portugal was the one I've kind of forgotten about, and that had a lot of colonies inside of Africa. I mean, I think they had at least a few. They had like somewhere between 4 and 8. I can't exactly remember how many colonies Portugal had during the colonization of Africa. But I know that they controlled the Republic of the Congo and a few other countries. There was a lot of the southern African countries became freed around this time. I think actually it was yesterday. It was like the 40th anniversary of I think Mozambique was liberated like 40 years ago. Or Namibia. It's one of those countries. A lot of these countries got liberated late, like in the 60s and 70s. Really, a lot of Africa was a similar situation. In Italy, didn't get rid of Libya until 1952, I think, when King Idris became the leader of Libya, who was ultimately just fell into the Israeli pocketbook. And in the end, the Gaddafi removed him in a bloodless coup, and that's when finally Libya got its true independence from the Western world. When Gaddafi took power, and then ultimately, for a short time, there was the Libyan Arab Republic, I think, where, before he eventually named it Jamahiriya. That was a later concept made after he wrote the Green Book. It was his official political ideology was talked about Arab socialism and the own Libyan nationalism, a few other things that he wanted included in his what he said was important. And one of the major things that was important was talking about the banking and going against the international banking system, which the gold dinar was that plan, and he almost liberated Africa from colonialism forever. He almost did one of the biggest feats of mankind have ever seen, which would have been the total liberation of Africa. And he once referenced Saladin, which I don't know if Saladin had the same kind of heart and the same kind of spirit for freedom when he liberated and conquered the country, or was it more of a conquering than a liberation? But I know Saladin had a massive impact on history. I don't really as much research history back, talk about the 600, 700 AD, but Gaddafi would have surpassed Saladin's impact on history if he had done that. They would have been comparing Saladin to Gaddafi rather than the other way around at the end of that if he was able to do it, but he wasn't able to do it. He was he fell a bit short on that, and ultimately, ultimately was killed in the process. He was very close to, I think, uniting via the African Union. I think he was within a few years of it. I think by now, if Gaddafi was still in power, the African Union would have already made the currency, because you see how quick BRICS has went in the last few years. I think they could have went that quick with the African Union and creating a fully developed, a fully functional bank against that would be completely sovereign and a fully functional currency within that time. The underlying moral, though, when you talk about Gaddafi, is that they'll go at any cost, they'll sponsor whoever in order to make sure that somebody that is against their banking system is taken out. They sponsored the Islamic terrorists inside of Libya, who later became these same ones became ISIS later inside of Libya. Then now ISIS controls a pretty big part of Libya, and even Gaddafi's former hometown is controlled by ISIS or ISIS allies, she said. And it's like they're the moderate rebels. That's what it's kind of the equivalent is these groups, the Muslim Brotherhood inside of Libya. Pretty much the same thing. It's the same Muslim Brotherhood that was, or Muslim Brotherhood allied government, which it's pretty much the same thing as the Muslim Brotherhood inside of Egypt, which we know what that was responsible for during its time of reign inside of Egypt. And now the Muslim Brotherhood has become recognized as a group that's pro-United. Ultimately, is a U.S. puppet group, and how the Nazis officially made the Muslim Brotherhood back in the 30s, and after the war, it became transferred to a British supported group, and then later it became a United States supported group, which now the United States utilizes in the Middle East in order to it pretty much makes states like Turkey and Qatar that are officially democratic, but they're ultimately not democratic, and they're actually pro-Palestinian is what they say, but they are not. They are they are ultimately just Zionist sellouts in the end. And inside of Africa, it's kind of like the same thing as the neo-colonial illusion that these countries are supposedly sovereign, and sometimes they even use like inflammatory rhetoric and doing some crazy proposals and stuff like that, like they actually do run their country, but they don't. And what comes to mind is there's the mad leader of I think it's Gambia. Yes, it's the one with that insane dictator. Rules with an iron fist there, and there it is. Yep, one of the most poorest countries in the world, right there with some of the Senegal and Sierra Leone. Very poverty stricken region, and the the leader's name is Yaha Jammeh. Yeah, that's it's definitely an out there name. Or wait, there's got actually a very is full long name. Here's a mouthful if you want to try to remember that. Yaha Abdul Aziz James Joknoon Jammeh. No, I'll try that again. Yahan Abdul Aziz Jamus Jonkun Jammeh. He was elected officially in 1996, 2001, 06, 2011, but these are sham elections. He's pretty much just a United States puppet dictator who always supported the United States strongly. He received his military training inside the United States, actually. Some of it in Fort McClellan, Fort. I didn't pronounce that right. It was at Fort McClellan, Alabama, and he received some in Senegal, and then later at Fort McClellan in Alabama, and then he rose to power in 1994 after a coup, and he's been always he's always been a very strong U.S. ally inside of that part of, probably the strongest U.S. ally inside the region. But they talk about the supposed Russian homophobia, and they say that they're strict because they don't allow them to fucking wave their dicks out in public. Practically, is what that rule said. Banning the gay pride parades, which were known to be extremely provocative inside of Russia, the stuff that they would form. And people will hate on me for saying that, but it's a little bit different than even the United States. I think the gay pride parades go too far. So I remember when I was little, and one time, and I remember there was pretty much what is like a quasi. It was like a quasi. Pretty much, they called it they made it seem like it was a family event, the Gecko Fest around here, but it also had this pretty much what looked like something on a gay pride parade, and what was there was definitely not family friendly, and kids shouldn't be seeing that. I see some of these pictures from other parades inside the United States, and it's like, I don't know if it might be a place where adults can go to, but it shouldn't be shown. It shouldn't be passed off as a family friendly thing, not because they're gay, but because they're being provocative and wearing skimpy outfits. And in Russia, we can take that even further and just go publicly nude and stuff like that, and simulate sexual actions in public. And that's definitely, I don't think people should be subject to that. And these people that live by these events that in Russia, and they have to see the stuff or stay inside. That's not cool. I think that I had no problem with that law being passed when I saw it, when the Russian anti-gay propaganda bill. But this stuff that happens with Yahya Jammeh, he said that he would introduce laws that would be some of the strictest on the planet, and that he said he would behead any gay or lesbian person inside the country. So it's pretty much tied. This is what Saudi Arabia does. I think they stone the homosexuals discovered inside of Saudi Arabia. And he gave him a final ultimatum to leave. And he's kept up with it. Even it wasn't just a one-time thing. He said that a few other times, similar things. And he said, kind of humorously, he said that LGBT can only stand for leprosy, gonorrhea, bacteria, and tuberculosis, which doesn't really have any connection to reality. I just find it. I wonder how long it took him to craft that up. If he came up with that off the top of his head, and he's kind of, I gotta say, he's a little bit of he might be a kind of a difficult person to deal with. He's pretty witty then. But I bet it took him a while before he probably was sitting there. Oh, okay, guys. I try to do an African accent there. I can't do the. I've noticed. I've done it. Tried to do my Italian accent earlier, and it didn't exactly work when I was with one of my friends. My accent game is not on point today, so chill out. And he also it's just said stuff that's. He said, I don't know if this must not be the one. I was thinking this is the guy that said he could talk to God. That's another American ally we have over there. I think it's like over there in Equatorial Guinea or something like that. We have there's a leader there that claims he's a spiritual medium or something like that can talk to God. I don't think this is the guy. I think maybe this is the guy, but he has also some more crazy stuff. I mean, Jammeh said he could cure HIV, AIDS, and asthma with natural herbs. If it was weed, he might actually be on the something because they've shown that it can help both of those things. But I don't think it was that. And he pretty much says he can. He pretty much says he could also treat infertility and high blood pressure with, which all this stuff I think there are. Well, high blood pressure, the first three, HIV, HIV, asthma, high blood pressure. It's true that there is an actual, may not necessarily cure, but treatment for this stuff, and it's with weed and cannabis. Infertility, I don't know. Good luck with that one. I really don't. I think that more likely that one. I think is more like living an unnatural lifestyle. Usually creates that, and there's a few other stuff. I talk about infertility in women. I don't even know too much into that. I believe it, just like your diet and stuff like that contributes to that mainly. Eating terribly processed foods leads to some of that stuff. I know that can contribute to that, but to say that you have a treatment for that's a little bit nutty. And he said people that don't believe in God are below a pig, which is which to me is not that low because pigs are pretty awesome actually. I believe in God, but I'm saying to say that of to alienate a Gnostic / atheist crowd like that, definitely something. It's funny because if anybody else, for example, if the Iranian president was to say these kind of things, and on a regular basis like he did, they would be playing it all the time on the TV. But with him, they whitewash it, and he goes right under the table. They don't even talk about it. When have you ever heard on the news them talking about Gambia and Yahya Jammeh? You don't, because that's one of America's closest allies in Africa, and they don't want to make it clear that maybe the United States might just fund some of the most wackiest people on the planet. I think the other guy though beats them. I saw the others, like this guy's pretty wacky, but it's like he's still not quite as wacky as I think it's Equatorial Guinea. It's the one country with the guy that says he can talk to God. I don't know. That corrects me up. And that he's a leader. I mean, that he's the president of a country, and that there's people. I mean, is that the entire people are that fooled by that guy? That just because he's the leader of the country, they believe that he's his word is true. No, it's not. You think that he might be able to get 20% of the dumbest population inside the country, but he must have a decent part, or else Africans are known to revolt and overthrow their leaders, and they haven't. Or unless he's got some kind of crazy security force, which is a possibility. Yeah, he said he told journalists that there is no freedom of speech inside the country, like absolutely none. It's not like Iran. They always compare, when they say that it's a religious state with no freedom of speech. This is actually a state that's not tolerant of any other religions. I don't think they're tolerant of Christianity, or I think they're just. This isn't an Islamic state, to make clear. This is truly an Islamic state without freedom, and the United States supports it. Iran allows other religions, and they have all kinds of journalism from other points of view inside their country, and you can get stuff from, Marxist point of view, even from the United States point of view, literature inside that country. There is freedom of speech there, but the United States says there's not, and they lie about it, and to make them look bad, while they actually support a country that's exactly everything that they claim Iran to be. There's more stuff here. Opening fire on students, similar to like Kent State that he was involved in. He also was involved in some. He was also. Here's some of the. He actually had a little witch hunt in March of 2009. I knew there was something really crazy about this guy. I remember it. He said that 1,000 people. That the witch he hired witch doctors, as he called them, to deal with their witchcraft, and said that they had been involved with witchcraft that related to the death of his aunt, which the guy is pretty old, or not pretty old, but pretty old in the African years, I guess, the 50s, something in that very poor country. I think his aunt dying wasn't had anything to do with witchcraft. More execution, more pretty much supporting pogroms against gay people. I'm just going through his list, and this is one guy they went through. And here he met with. There's a picture with him and Barack Obama just in August of 2014. Obama looks as happy as can be. They all look pretty happy. Michelle was the first lady of. His first lady's not bad looking, but. Because she's only 18 years old or something like that in 2010. She's only like 22 or something like that in this picture. No wonder. I was like, that's a pretty good looking wife that Yahya Jammeh has here for this fat pig. And I mean, Obama's a pretty skinny dude, but this guy's like 3 times the size of. It might be all the clothes he's wearing. That's possible. And he's got. He's got honorary doctorates from American universities, and he also has the honorary. He's a Kentucky colonel apparently. So he starts frying up some chicken. He can make some. He can be Colonel Yame or Colonel Jame. Jame's Kentucky Fried Chicken, and have the Jame on there. I know that's not racist at all, just because I'm talking about an African leader. He's only 51. This dude has been in power this long. Shit. He's been in power since 1994. So he was only 20 something when he took power. And just remember when you were talking about the School of America, I guess the Fort McClellan was somewhat like the School of America and raised this African tyrant for the United States in the 90s when they gave him his training. Let's see, I'd say it was in the 90s he received his training there. And that's only just one dictator over there that the United States sponsored over the years. He's currently in charge, and you go over to I think this is Ecuador. I want to read this guy's file, the one that was talking about that can talk to God supposedly, because that guy also had some crazy list. I mean, it's kind of funny. It's just it's like these people are fucking leaders, and you're stuck at your $8 an hour job. If they actually believe this stuff, these people are idiots / completely insane. The fact that they're able to get their people to believe this stuff is absolutely crazy. I mean, there's got to be some pretty dumb people. No offense to them, but the propaganda it only can go so far. It's your own ignorance / your own stupidity at that point if you're going to believe stuff like that. I guess it's just ingrained from childhood. Then it's easier to believe. But I don't know. This is a fascist dictatorship supported by the United States. The leader right here is Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mabasco. I'm just gonna call him Teodoro Mabasco. Okay, he has been the leader of the country since 1979. He's only 70 years old, so been since he was pretty young, the leader of the country. He when he was in he actually before was a some kind of detention officer of some kind under when it was I think it was he went to the military academy in Spain, and I think when a previous government he would severely torture inmates. There was a bloody coup that he was involved in, and he overthrew his own uncle actually in 1979 and placed him on trial, including genocide, and he sentenced to death 101 times. I don't know what that's for. I mean, you only can die once. I mean, unless you're Cav, then you got 9 lives. I don't know what 101 sentence. It's like when they send somebody at 400 years. I get it somewhat, so they can't get out with parole or whatever. And here's another picture. Obiang was Obama right there in 2009. And it shows because he had very good relations with the United States most of his time. And even though he had somewhat of a cool down, there was a turnaround. After 2001, after 9/11, the United States justified supporting him again, or were able to, and they had a very long a list of things they did together, state visits and stuff like that. It says the PR company Cassidy and Associates may be partially responsible for the change in tone, they say. Since 2004, it says that the dictator's government, employed by the dictator's government at a rate of $120,000 a month. That's what it says here. I think the United States, they've had they just wanted to use them because he's just a useful tool. I don't think there's anything to do unless they were like maybe possibly they could have been bought out or something. That he's been described as a god by his own media. He has this crazy cult of personality. He has many towns and cities have streets commemorating him. It's just like an all-out. They talk about it all the time on North Korea's or a cult of personality or something like that. But this goes even further than that. And this is kind of similar to quite a few. I mean. Other dictators in the past in Africa that the U.S. or the West sponsored, but he also became the third longest ruling non-royal head of state in the world. He has been described as the worst dictator inside of Africa, and his wealth is very wealthy, even though that he's in one of the most poorest countries in the world. And this is what they're saying. The craziest thing is that here it is. Here's one more thing that supposedly he does to gain power or to field for when he goes on one of his power trips. They say that he's done cannibalism, which how wacky this guy is. I can believe that he might have possibly. And It's Always Sunny episode comes to mind where I think they ate the human meat, but it's actually just a hamburger or something like that served to them. I don't know. Maybe that's how it started. Maybe it was some trick that played, but then they get some unquenchable thirst that doesn't actually exist. But yeah, cannibalism. That's what your tax dollars are supporting over there in Africa. This is again. I've just talked about the menaces. It seems like so far over there in Africa because they're menaces, despite being absolutely horrible people that have killed thousands and people and imprisoned millions of people. These are pretty comical to laugh on these traits and these characteristics of these leaders. I mean, these people seem to be like jokes. I mean, he being described as a god. I mean, I think this is what the media said that. They literally called him a god, and anybody that disobeys him is going to hell like he has the control of that.
It reminds. It's kind of like they described them as here's another one that was similar. Is the one that controlled Zaire in the past, all the way up to controlled all the way up to 1997 for like 32 years. He controlled the Congo. President of Zaire is no longer. It's the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There's two Congos apparently. There's the Republic of the Congo and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Which that dictator took charge after they deposed of Patrice Lumumba out of power. Mobutu Sese Seko, the flashy dictator from, if you remember, in the Rumble in the Jungle, remember the big portrait that they have in the stadium, where they had that fight at 4 a.m. and between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman. The stadium that they packed at 4 a.m. And these people were probably hand selected by the guy, knowing how the things worked in these countries. The portrait was of himself, that dictator. And by the way, his name is, and I've referenced him many times. Let me try to get the full name: Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Negabondu Wazu Banga, or just simply Joseph Mobutu, or Mobutu Seko. This is the shortest name, Seko. I'm just gonna call him Seko because that's a mouthful. That's like 6 different names right there. I'm gonna go over the Juicy White Chat and just see what because I had I didn't get into the good stuff till the end. I think that was worth it right there. Talk about these what are faults for a leader over there. What they I mean, these dictators, the stories of them. I mean, it's just absolutely bizarre. I mean, I know that the same kind of repression happens in other countries, and I've talked about in South America and stuff like that, but this is just absolutely insane. Talk about the little guy who thinks he can talk to God or whatever. Anyways, it's some random conversation. It seems like I've jumped into. I see something about a gun. Something about kicking some guy's ass. I don't know what they. I always run into something in some completely out of context conversation. I can't find where the start of the conversation was. I don't know, but I can't find anything recent. I'm having problems loading it. I will talk a little bit about one of the heroes is Thomas Sankara, who's been described as the African Che Guevara. He was one of the few people ever in South Africa he went through the whole thing. He was just a revolutionary who fought against the oppressive Burkina Faso regime, but prior to him, and he went from low-level revolutionary to the president of the country. He was a hero, and it was his revolutionary tactics, his guerrilla warfare, and his revolutionary spirit. They were able to retake their country, the people of Burkina Faso, for 4 years before the French sponsored a coup, which brought about a government that is pretty much now still fighting for power, and they were in charge all the way uncontested until 2014, which is weird. It's like I found out about the guy literally like weeks before the revolution happened, and then he was deposed. And then after that, I think they were thrown out. The new government, the provisional government, was thrown out, and then a new one was brought about after like another coup, and that was being controlled by the AFRICOM, which is in Djibouti, which is over there by Eritrea. In Somalia, which Eritrea is that's another kind of enigma of a country, because they're like a country that like kind of sits on the fence. For example, they've taken this a pretty controversial stance by siding with the Houthis in nearby Yemen, which are right across the
think it's the Strait of Aden. So they have done that, went against U.S. foreign policy recently, but they've also been pretty much with a on and off relationship, most of the time on, I think, with the United States government. But it's not quite like as close as these two, I don't think, over there in Gambia with Jammeh and the Equatorial Guinea dictator that's in charge over there. And over there in Burkina Faso, we had Thomas Sankara did all kinds of crazy stuff during the revolution, and then later became the leader of his country. And he's kind of his story is pretty inspiring, but in the end, he gets killed in the coup. I think that it's kind of bittersweet. It's kind of like how what happened to Che in the end, but Che partially was because of a betrayal of the Soviets supporting the Soviets had the policy that they wouldn't support any more revolutions west of the over in the Western Hemisphere due to a treaty that they signed with the United States, and that they forced their proxy party in over there in Bolivia, the Bolivian Communist Party, supported the Soviet Union, so they did not help Che, and in the end, Che had no help inside of Bolivia and just was ultimately captured by the Bolivian forces, who later, at the behest of the United States, executed him. And that's when Che looked at him and looked at the man who was about to shoot him and said, just shoot me. I'm just a man, but my idea, pretty much what he said is that I'm just a man, but my ideas will continue on. And they executed him, and then they buried him in some location that they later found him many years later. I guess if that's of any consolation to anybody, that's they found him and reburied him inside of the Cuba. But Che and Thomas Sankara was a similar bittersweet ending to the story. And I think he's less known again because it seems like we're disinterested, and that's a question. Why are we so disinterested with African history and what has happened to Africa? And because it very quickly realized it's a different story than what has been told to us. That rather than them being poor, they've been exploited and they've been robbed by, when you look at it, it's the imperialism of NATO, of the United States. Zionism has been involved. New World Order has been involved in order to what should be the world's most powerful continent, and it has the most resources of any country of any continent on the planet. I would say it's the most natural resource-rich continent on the planet. They have enough. They have enough resources to probably for the whole entire world, and yet they don't have enough for their own because, like I said, foreign interests come in, swoop them, foreign corporations swoop them, and then later sell back them for double what's worth. Well, anyways, we're wrapping up the show here. Thanks everyone for tuned in to UCY Radio. Stay tuned on my for any updates on the co-host situation for next week, and probably have by Wednesday or so we'll have some kind of a show set up for next week, and we'll have details on that for July 3rd. Thanks everyone for tuning in to UCY Radio and Voice of Rebellion Radio tonight. Might do some kind of podcast sometime in the week. Haven't gotten as much time lately to do them. But this week, try to squeeze one in, maybe at least a 30-minute
point of no return and nobody can stop it. Malcolm Little when he knelt before Elijah Muhammad, the comet that killed the dinosaurs, changing the earth. They love to criticize, they always say I changed for the worse. Like prescription pills when you misusing them, nigga. The Templar Knights when they took Jerusalem, nigga, and figured out what was buried under Solomon's temple, Al-Aqsa. The name is not coincidental. I know too much, the government is trying to murder me. No coming back like cutting your wrists open vertically. How could the serpent be purposely put in charge of the country? Genetic engineered sickness spread amongst me. My people are so hungry that they attack without reason, like a fucking dog ripping off the hand that feeds him. Immortal technique is treason to the Patriot Act. So come and get me, motherfucker, cause I'm not coming back. This is the point from which I can never return, and if I back down now, then